You're listening to episode 78 of Pause de Chipotle. I'm your host, Rocio Carvajal, food anthropologist, Mexican culture and gastronomy educator. And on this podcast, I explore the gastronomic traditions of Mexico and bring together the voices of cooks, authors, and entrepreneurs who build cross-cultural bridges around the world, championing Mexican food. To find more information about my podcasts, publications, and subscribe to my newsletter, simply go to the notes of this episode on your podcast app. My guest today, Dr. Edward Shawcross, gives a very compelling and rich study of the political, ideological, and sociological conditions that led to the unimaginable events that revived, if only for a moment, the long-lost imperial Habsburg dreams in the Americas. Helped by the greed of Mexican conservatives and European opportunists that orchestrated an international conspiracy that had two unsuspected pawns. Beautiful, naive, trusting, and arrogant, Maximilian was the younger brother of the Austrian emperor and head of the House of Habsburg, Franz Joseph I. The last emperor of Mexico is so much more than the story of Maximilian and his wife Charlotte of Belgium. It is a work that captures the zeitgeist of a bygone era that is fundamental in the history of Mexico, with deep connections to the global geopolitical dynamics of the 19th century. This book brings two continents together at a moment when we are now critically revising the consequences of imperialism and coloniality. Let me give you some context about the historical moment that this book explores. From the early years of the 1800s, it will become clear that this century was going to be very complicated and full of life-changing events. It all started when Mexico was still a viceroyalty of Spain, but the increasing social effervescence of the criollo elite had joined independentist movements that sent shockwaves throughout Latin America, culminating in the actual War of Independence that polarized society between aspiring Republicans and conservative royalists who didn't want to give up their privileges and would rather remain under Spain's control. Despite the lack of unity, independence was finally achieved on September 27, 1821, and with it, a new free nation under the name of Mexican Empire was born. The victorious military campaign was led by Agustín de Iturbide, a former royalist who wasted no time to call in favors to get himself appointed as Emperor Agustín I, head of the First Mexican Empire. However, his imperial dreams came to an abrupt end when he lost the support of his allies and abdicated in March 1823. He was named public enemy of the state, and anyone who gave any support to him or his cause will be declared traitor. Iturbide fled to Italy, where he got the support of one of Europe's most influential dynasties, the Bonapartes. Marie-Pauline Bonaparte offered the Iturbide family refuge at one of her properties in Liorna. Pauline was sister of Napoleon Bonaparte and aunt of Louis Napoleon, who would grow on to become Napoleon III, a figure that many years later became instrumental in the rise and fall of the Second Mexican Empire. The Iturbide family moved from Italy to England, from where Agustín came back to Mexico, breaking the terms of his exile, despite claiming that his intention was to warn the Mexican government of an imminent international plot. He was apprehended upon his arrival and almost immediately executed on July 19, 1824. For the following 32 years, Mexico went on to have a tumultuous succession of 26 presidents, some of them lasting less than a year in office, which created political volatility, civil unrest, and a disastrous economic crisis. But at the end of these 3 chaotic decades, one of Mexico's most influential political figures of all time rose to power. But the presidency of Benito Juárez had a Herculean task ahead: rebuild a nation, dismantle the political control of the church, and secure the construction of a republican project. But the biggest challenge yet came with the 2 consecutive French invasions, one in 1862, when luckily the Republican troops defeated the Zouaves in the infamous Battle of Puebla on May 5th. Only to return 2 years later in 1864 with the aim to bring down Juárez's government and prepare the way for the arrival of the Habsburg emperors, Ferdinand Maximilian Joseph Maria von Habsburg and Marie-Charlotte Amélie Augustine Victoire Clémentine Léopoldine, or Charlotte I, otherwise known in Mexico as Maximiliano and Carlota, who only ruled from 1864 to 1867. This is one of Mexico's most bizarre and fascinating historical episodes, where nothing went according to plan, and almost every player fell victim to their own ignorance, ambition, and poor decision-making. This is a history of the Mexican Habsburg Empire. Now, before we start with the interview, let me tell you a little bit about my guest, Dr. Shawcross. After completing a degree in ancient and modern history at the University of Oxford, Edward went on to live and work at very different places, from France to Korea and Colombia. He eventually returned to England and pursued his academic passions with a master's in history followed by a PhD at UCL. And his doctoral dissertation is called French Imperial Projects in Mexico between 1820 and 1867, a work that in time inspired his now acclaimed book, The Last Emperor of Mexico, the dramatic story of the Habsburg Archduke who created a kingdom in the New World. And without any further delay, I hope you enjoy this episode. Edward, it's such a pleasure to have you here on the show. Thank you so much for making the time. I'm absolutely thrilled to talk about one of the most exciting moments and weird historical events in Mexico's history.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me. Greetings from a cold, rainy London.
Well, hopefully it will warm up soon. Now, in the introduction of the episode, I give a very quick overview of what was happening in Mexico in the following decades after achieving its independence from Spain in 1821, which is like, what begins all of these prepares the events that followed. So similarly, across Latin America, other colonies or former colonies were immersed in these process of independentist movements. However, we all know that moving forward from centuries of old colonial rule was not an easy task, and a significant number of groups from the old elites, part of the old regime, would rather shift things back to the way they were. So can you please give us some context about what was going on meanwhile in Europe at the time, and why we find France instigating Britain and Spain to take full-blown military action against Mexico over a debt that wasn't really that, it was manageable. And that would eventually lead to this idea to force a Habsburg Empire in Mexico. But first, what was happening in Europe?
Right. So in Europe, not dissimilar to Mexico, actually, there's a huge amount of political instability. And the key date here is 1848. There's a revolution in Paris, as there often is. And the King of France is deposed, he abdicates, flees to England. And a republic is proclaimed. Now, the election for that republic returns an unexpected candidate, a man called Louis Napoleon, who soon becomes Napoleon III. really interesting and key figure for us. He's a devious man. So he's elected by a landslide, and he would have been re-elected, but the constitution prohibited him from standing for a second term. Now, if you know your Bonapartist history, you'll know there's a simple solution for a man like Louis Napoleon, and that is, of course, the coup d'etat. So he launches that against his own regime and then creates what's called the Second French Empire and becomes Napoleon III, which is how he's better known to history. And there's something quite interesting in this, because what he's done is he's launched an attack against democracy and he's ended a republic. And of course, he's turned it into a monarchy with himself as an emperor. And so, as we'll get on to see, this is a model that he tries to replicate with disastrous consequences in Mexico. So why is his attention drawn to Mexico? Well, as you say, the pretext is this is debt. After there's a civil war in Mexico, 1858 to 1861, Benito Juarez triumphs, enters Mexico City, but the government is bankrupt. So they suspend payment on foreign debt. And as you say, this debt is not actually that big. It's not unmanageable. And most of it's not owed to France. It's actually owed to Britain, in fact, and loans taken out in the 1820s. But that civil war I mentioned, the conservatives who lost to the liberals, many of them have fled in exile to Paris, and they pitch an idea to Napoleon III, which is, rather than just a sort of one-off debt collection mission, what they could do is they could back the conservative faction and impose a monarchy on Mexico. And so, as I said, Napoleon III, incredibly devious man, he doesn't really tell his allies. So it's a joint intervention with Britain, France, and Spain, which is normally just to recover that debt that's been suspended. Napoleon III's sort of, as I say, someone who loves conspiracy and gambles and back channels of diplomacy. So he's really hoping that it's going to play out very differently to this one-off debt collection mission, that when the Allied forces arrive in Mexico, Mexican conservatives and royalists will flock to the French banner.
Gosh, well, things escalated very quickly. And like you said, these new actions carried on by Benito Juarez's government really hit where it hurts for these very conservative groups. So the reform laws that you briefly mentioned, were viewed, as the last stroke aimed at dismantling the remaining of the political control of the Catholic Church and all the allies, of course, and without any chance for the old Spanish aristocracy to recover their privileges. So, yes, of course, we can argue that the level of statecraft in Mexico was still significantly underdeveloped, hence they need to secure loans in order to stabilize things, which sets to a very difficult and compromised situation. So what does Napoleon III say? Like, which promises does he make, and which pieces does he have to set in motion on behalf of European powers? Because it's not just his own making. He needs to get all the people involved into this idea of a Mexican empire. So together with Mexican royalists, they start moving and convincing others in Europe to give this illusion that a Habsburg Empire will succeed, and that's what really we need. Like, how on earth does he get people on board with this crazy mission?
Great question. Yeah, absolutely. How do you get people on board? Because, as you say, it is quite outlandish, to say the least. This plan is what we'd call regime change today. Of course, the plan is brought to him by the Mexican conservatives. So, to some extent, the Mexican conservatives have misled Napoleon III in the sense that they have massively exaggerated the support that they have in Mexico. And, the Mexican Conservative Party is not a monarchist party. It's actually only a subset of conservatives who believe that Mexico should be transformed back into a monarchy and replicating what happened at independence. But Napoleon III, as I say, devious man. So first of all, of course, for a monarchy, you need a monarch. Right. And that man is Maximilian. Now, we'll get into him a bit more later, I imagine. But in terms of what Napoleon III needs to do, is he needs to convince Maximilian that this is a tremendous idea and he'll be welcomed as a hero. And so huge amounts of disinformation, letters, correspondence, which go backwards and forwards between Maximilian and Napoleon III when this idea is first raised and whether Maximilian would be interested. And essentially, saying that monarchy is incredibly popular, you'll be welcomed as a liberator. Benito Juarez, he might claim to be a liberal, but he's actually a despot, and it's a radical minority of liberals who are oppressing Catholic Mexico. He also, as we've already discussed, he's misleading Britain and Spain because, of course, it is a joint intervention initially, and Spain potentially might have been interested in getting involved, but very quickly distanced itself from the project, and Britain not at all. And Maximilian's a real Anglophile, and he also knows that for a project like this to succeed in the 19th century, you need Britain on board, right? Because Britain is a global superpower. But Britain has no interest in spending, what would be tens of millions of pounds in those days, which is a huge amount now, and 20,000 men or whatever it would take to install a Habsburg emperor in Mexico. So Palmerston is actually prime minister and more famously as foreign secretary and director of British foreign policy. He is just astonished when Napoleon III said that, this is the plan. And this is particularly when he finds out that Maximilian, one of his conditions is that Britain supports it. And so Britain has no interest in backing this plan at all. But Napoleon III convinces Maximilian that actually Britain is backing it. And this is just an example of the sort of disinformation that he's constantly feeding to Maximilian.
Well, thank goodness he didn't have Twitter, because God knows what he would have done. But you made a very good point. We do need to talk about the Habsburgs, and we need to talk about Maximilian. So we just sort of laid the pieces in our chessboard now. So let's turn our attention to this royal family. So Maximilian, youngest brother of Franz Joseph, the Kaiser, great Kaiser, who did a great job at holding it all together for the Habsburg Empire, who had no shortage of problems, obviously. And I think, let's see if you agree with me, that very much like Tsar Nicholas I later, the Habsburgs were part of a dying breed. They were absolutely unprepared and reluctant to accept and see that they would no longer have a role to play in the new growing Republican horizon in Europe. And that they had to change or die, and they would, I think, rather choose to die, or die in denial. So Maximilian proved to have a lot more, in my opinion, more sensibility and sensitivity towards understanding that these type of compromises that had to be made. And while he may not have had a full understanding of Mexico's circumstances, however interested he was in world politics and what have you, he quickly aligned himself with very progressive ideas from the Enlightenment textbook. Like, really. So what do you think that set Maximilian apart from the rest of European aristocracy?
Yeah, that's right. So Maximilian is very unlike his brother, Franz Joseph, who, as you say, becomes Emperor of Austria, again in 1848. So it's a really important year. Franz Joseph is very autocratic, very rigid, conservative. I mean, reactionary would probably be a better word. Maximilian's much more outgoing, he's much more gregarious, and as you say, he's much more liberal. And actually, he sees the way that Franz Joseph cracks down after the revolutions of 1848 with brutal repression, and this is something that he's deeply traumatized and upset by. He's sort of summary executions, imprisonments, etc. What Maximilian is he's much more orientated towards Western Europe, right? So countries like Britain, France to some extent, and crucially Belgium, because Maximilian's wife is Princess Charlotte, and she's the daughter of the Belgian king. Now, Belgium, it's a monarchy. It's created in 1831. And again, so, it seems so odd just to sort of pluck kings out and create monarchies. But it's something that happens in Europe in the 19th century and before a lot. So for someone like Maximilian or even Napoleon III, creating a monarchy is it's just what you do. But Maximilian thinks that if monarchy is to survive as an institution, exactly as you say, it must be based on that liberal constitutional model that you have in Britain, to some extent in France, and definitely in Belgium. So his influences are much more Western than Franz Joseph. He's much more situated in that traditional Habsburg autocratic type of rule. So Maximilian certainly has very different views to the majority of his family, in fact.
Mm-hmm. And the majority of the older generation, and even his own generation, I would think, because he went on to seek change, outside of the own boundaries of Europe. So, in a nutshell, obviously, I've touched these in previous episodes. The run-up to install this Habsburg Empire occurs as an aftermath of the first failed invasion to Mexico, which gave us the famous Cinco de Mayo battle in my hometown of Puebla. But then they come back again. So this is 1862. They come back again. 1864. This time they succeed because also they get the crucial support of conservative royalists, quote unquote, but conservative troops in Mexico. So that is fundamental to that, secure that victory. And again, with Napoleon III's great deception abilities, he convinces oh my God, it was so easy peasy. We secured it, and it was just three people who didn't agree. let's get you on a ship and send you to Mexico. So they get here. And they realize that things are not, absolutely not the way they have been portrayed. But this is gradual, because there's all of these sort of curtain of smoke and mirrors trying to prevent them from realizing. But these are two very intelligent young people. You know, they have their flaws, they're arrogant, they're young, and I love that description you give of them. But they very quickly start upsetting everyone around them, because they start taking their own decisions, and they are doing things in a completely different way. So what do you think? Let's imagine that Juarez wouldn't have put up a fight. However, probably he stayed in the US or he died. So this is a very grim scenario. But without Juarez out of the equation, what do you think would have happened with Charlotte and Maximilian having this very liberal approach? And then having all these people who supported them, and they're like, no, hello, we brought you here for another reason. I think they would have carried on doing whatever they wanted. Would have they succeeded? Like, what kind of scenario they would have had?
It's a great question, because listeners will be thinking, well, he's been called by Mexican conservatives, but Maximilian himself is a liberal. So and it's there were various promises made back in Europe between Maximilian and conservatives, and conservatives argue that he broke those promises, because, of course, what they want is Juarez's laws, reform laws, to be overturned, particularly the attacks on the Catholic Church. And the key one is the nationalization of church property. The Catholic Church, of course, the biggest landowner in Mexico in the 1850s, and that property is not for sale on the open market; it's in perpetuity, belongs to the church. That's nationalized, during the 1850s and sold off. To conservatives, this is impious. This is it's an atheist attack on what they consider to be the one true faith, right? So when Maximilian arrives in Mexico, and he's got a lot of liberal ideas, and particularly when it comes to church-state relations, and this is you have a difference, of course, between, again, Western Europe and Mexico, because in France, in the French Revolution, the nationalization of church property had been the great settlements of the revolution, which pretty much everyone in France in the mid-19th century agrees with. And so even Napoleon III, who has come to power as an autocrat and coup d'etat against his own government, he can't support in Mexico the church property being returned to the Catholic Church. So there's this enormous disjuncture between what the Mexican conservatives want and what Maximilian and Napoleon III are going to give them. But Maximilian's liberalism, he is a genuine liberal, a moderate liberal, and he's not, of course, a radical. He wouldn't have gone as far as Benito Juarez, but he does confirm the nationalization of church property, and in fact, many other of the great reforms from the 1850s. And in that question, what the conservatives make of that? Well, they're horrified. They essentially sort of withdraw their support for the empire. So they're obviously not going to fight against it. But you see ministers resign. You see some of the leading generals are sent out of Mexico so that they can't cause Maximilian any trouble. But Maximilian's decision is also a pragmatic one, because although those conservatives are unhappy, they are not, of course, going to fight against the empire. And when push comes to shove, they will back it, right? He's got to win over the majority in Mexico, who are, the conservatives have lost the Civil War. If they had been able to win that Civil War, they wouldn't have needed a monarchy or French help. So Maximilian, his liberalism is genuine, but it's also pragmatic. The conservatives are deeply upset by it. It's a really interesting question, what would have happened without Benito Juarez. The French have this idea that if you can sort of chase him out of Mexican territory, he'll somehow resign the presidency. But even some of Juarez's closest politicians and advisors suggest that he should resign, because the combined forces of Mexican imperialistas with the French army seems to be insurmountable odds. But I mean, it's such a heroic resistance on his part, and the liberals who do continue to fight with him, that he's eventually able to roll back the tide. I think I do. It is the figure of Benito Juarez, endlessly fascinating, of course, great Mexican hero. But he is, extraordinary. I think so. To continue that struggle against the French army and against the conservative allies that are fighting with him was quite an extraordinary decision, and one, of course, that worked out very well for him in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, also another thing odd in many ways is that the very liberal criollos that were backing up Juarez's and really supported his most radical ideas were deeply fascinated by many French ideals and the whole Enlightenment. So at some point in history, there was even sort of like considered, under a kind of serious light, the possibility of installing French as official language in Mexico, because they wanted to cut all ties with Spain, but obviously they were criollos, so they were not going to take on an indigenous language as their main. So like, we need to be progressive, we need to be, cultured, we need to be European, but which European? French. And now, this happens. So it's like it confronts them with the worst reality possible. But then again, we tend to view history as a very fractioned thing, and national stories as fractioned, and like, Mexico's history, But these chapters shows us how well connected and how intertwined world politics and geopolitics were even at this moment. So there's in your book a lot of emphasis, which I really, really like, about what was happening here in the northern part of the continent, in the Americas. So particularly the role of the US, both as an instigator, constantly harassing Mexico, invading Mexico, and at the same time, it becomes the great ally. Obviously, it comes with a kind of a quid pro quo. They look something in return. But why don't you help us put this in perspective? Because Juarez ends up taking refuge there, during his exile, and gets enough support, money and otherwise, to come back. So what is this connection, and what's the role in the eventual fall of the Habsburg Empire?
Yeah, so the United States of America plays a crucial role, and first and foremost, it's the resistance of Benito Juarez, right? But what Juarez needs to do is he needs to hold out for long enough for the U.S. Civil War to end. Because of course, we always here in Europe, we sort of think of the U.S. Civil War and it sort of blocks out everything else that's going on in North America. But in Mexico, you have, of course, a civil war going on as well, right? Now, the reason that civil war is crucial is because in the United States of America, that is something called the Monroe Doctrine. Now, the Monroe Doctrine is formulated in 1823, and the idea is that European governments cannot interfere in the Latin American republics. Right, so European colonies that are already in the Caribbean, or some, even on the mainland of South America, that's fine. But something like what Napoleon III is doing, absolutely unacceptable. Because of course, the United States of America is hostile to monarchy as an institution, and it doesn't want to see burgeoning French power growing on the continent or any other European power. But while torn apart by civil war, Abraham Lincoln and his Secretary of State, William Sherwood, they cannot antagonize France by insisting that France withdraws its troops or putting any kind of meaningful pressure on France, because that might result in France recognizing the Confederacy, the other side in the Civil War, or worse still, becoming militarily involved in the US Civil War. Of course, the US Civil War ends in April 1865. And from that moment, the United States of America is now able to apply significant pressure to France and Napoleon III. The first thing they do is they lift an arms embargo. During the Civil War, there was an arms embargo. No weapons could go into Mexico. So the Juaristas are badly supplied. They're running out of money. They can also now raise loans much more easily in the United States of America after the Civil War has gone. So they're beginning to resupply. They're beginning to get credit. And then the final thing that the United States of America does is essentially issues an ultimatum to Napoleon III. Get out of Mexico or face war with the United States of America. Now, of course, Napoleon III, the whole plan, one of the main reasons that he had gone into Mexico was to try and challenge US power, right? And all he actually manages to do is witness it firsthand. It's an amazing quote from one of his advisors who's sort of talking about the rise of the United States of America, and of course from the US-Mexican War, again, 1848 with the peace treaty where nearly half the national territory is lost. And he says, one day the United States of America will be so powerful it'll be able to dictate terms to Europe. Shock horror, in the 19th century, if you're a European statesman, that's that sort of absurd nightmare that you would have. And so the United States of America needs to be checked. And part of the way of doing that is this empire on its southern border. But the United States of America, emerging from that Civil War, it's got the largest army it's ever had in its history. It's got hundreds of thousands of trained killers on the border with Mexico, ready to go. You've got US generals like Ulysses S. Grant, who's determined to invade. He keeps telling the president, who after Lincoln is Andrew Johnson, we've got 50,000 men on the border. Let's march them in, kick out the French. And Napoleon III, of course, does not want to have a war with the United States of America. So the resistance of Juarez buys enough time before diplomatic pressure can be put on to Napoleon III. And then in the January 1866, he announces, he does that thing actually, which is from recent Western interventions. There's always that moment where a politician stands up and says, mission accomplished. He says Mexico is pacified. That's the euphemism he uses for the brutal counterinsurgency tactics against Faristas. And therefore, our troops can come home. Now, he's not going to be immediate. It's going to be a phased withdrawal. So those troops are going to stay until the end of 1867. But he has, for all intents and purposes, abandoned Maximilian.
So pretty much everyone is kicking the proverbial beehive, and it has disastrous consequences, and also reveals many things for everyone. And there's many lessons that will be historically very important. And I think, Juarez's itinerant republic, as is known in Mexico, this period when he's fleeing, holding the documents of the nation, like he embodies the nation. It's a very bizarre episode. But he manages to survive, attempts to murder him and, many, many risks. I think, all in all, the Habsburg Empire ends up doing him a really great service, I think. So here in Mexico, obviously, the way we learn and study this history and the historiography of this event also teaches us that all the impacts of the Habsburg Empire. So it reveals to some extent the willingness of royalists and conservatives, of power seekers, like they will do anything to benefit themselves at any cost. So that is very clear for everyone. And it also serves a purpose, again, like I said, galvanizing a nationalist and Republican sentiment. If there was a weak one, now it's a very strong one, at least in some, big groups in the civil population, which helps Juarez, restore and support his most radical ideas and to succeed, So I think it's fundamental, this episode, to transition into a secular constitutional republic. And maybe, again, dreaming in a parallel universe of madness, in the multiverse, the Habsburg multiverse of madness, Juarez and Maximilian would have been best friends because they would have agreed on many, many things. Now, in your book, you make a very good balance showing us both sides of the geopolitical dynamics. Again, what's happening in America, what's happening in France. Now, in the rest of Europe, how is all this French meddling in the Americas perceived? What do people say at the time and the aftermath? Because I would like to think that, all those that supported Napoleon III are nowhere to be seen afterwards, no?
Mm-hmm. So initially, the reaction is shock. That France is going to, it's because it's a massive undertaking. Sending 30,000 troops, billions of dollars in today's money is what it's going to cost. But you have to remember that most of Europe is monarchical and is ruled, by monarchies. So it's in the sense of sort of spreading the idea of monarchy and rolling back republicanism, which people like Franz Joseph, for example, Maximilian's brother, considered to be a very dangerous and radical experiment. So there is broad support for that, certainly at state level, and of course, although Britain doesn't get involved, it does play a slightly ambiguous role. And again, Palmerston comes into this because, as we said, Maximilian made one of his conditions that Britain should guarantee the empire. Palmerston refuses to do that, but his foreign secretary, Lord Russell, wants to write to Maximilian and say, look, he's making a condition of going to Mexico. We're never going to support it in that way. We should tell him. And Palmerston says, no, don't leave it ambiguous, because Palmerston is incredibly anti-American himself, and he's fearful of the rise of the United States of America. And remember that in the 1860s, no one thinks that U.S. expansion is over. Everyone thinks that the northern states of Mexico will be annexed to the United States of America, and that process will continue, potentially to the point whereby there is no independent Mexico anymore. And so Palmerston and Britain, it's ambivalent. They say, well, if the French can do this, and if they can create a stable monarchy in Mexico, and we don't have to do anything, then they're happy with that. The other two players, of course, Franz Joseph and the Austrian Empire. Now, initially, Franz Joseph is quite keen on the scheme because Maximilian, as I said, he's outgoing, he's liberal, he's popular. So getting his younger, more popular brother out of Austria and into his own kingdom, where he's no longer a sort of rival focus of power, is quite an attractive proposition to him. But he quickly realizes, and his foreign ministry as well, they realize that Napoleon III is lying to them, that the project is going to be incredibly difficult, and that it's not going to be a good idea, to put it mildly. So again, his position is slightly ambivalent. What he does allow is for recruitment of foreign volunteers, and actually, there's about 6,000 or 7,000 people from the Habsburg monarchy. So remember, this is not just modern day Austria. This is places like Poland, Croatia, Bosnia, whatever it might be. He allows them to be recruited, as does the King of Belgium, Charlotte's father, Leopold. So there is quite a lot of support initially for Maximilian's empire. Two enormous loans are raised on the money markets of London and Paris, which ordinary people subscribe to. So there's also financial backing. But there is also a lot of opposition as well. You mentioned those links between Mexican liberals and European ones, and in France itself, the policy is hugely unpopular with the people because no one understands what the point is. It's what on earth are French troops doing in Mexico? You've got Prussia, which is a rising militaristic power on the border with France, but having your army in Mexico is not necessarily ideal. And of course, you've got Republicans in France who see this as a fantastic cause that they can get behind and use to criticize the government of Napoleon III. So at state level, there is quite a lot of support for Maximilian, but actually, in more in terms of popular politics, it's much more difficult to gauge, and there's plenty of opposition.
So basically, it had many reactions from people from across the Habsburg Empire. Obviously, a very complex territory with many nationalities, with many regional identities. However, some people actually get engaged, and they're like, "Okay, let's go for it, and let's show some support." They come, and obviously everything crumbles and breaks down in a very nasty way for everyone. So the downfall of Maximilian and Charlotte, like you just have said, painted this very thorough picture. It was the result of a lot of political intrigue, betrayal, greed, arrogance, and naivety. But dramatic as Maximilian's execution was, his very sad end, he ends up. Well, we don't need to dwell on that, but things get nasty even after his execution. All in all, I think it was a much more dignified end than the one that Charlotte had to endure for many decades to come. And something we haven't touched on is the centuries-old Habsburg connection between Mexico and the colonial the colonial period with another Habsburg, which actually is what links this Habsburg lineage, but sort of making a parallel story with the quote unquote madness of Charlotte and how she sort of realizes that she's been a pawn in all of these, and she is left high and dry. So she's very emotional. She breaks down, but very much like another woman that had married a Habsburg that ends up crazy, quote unquote, Joan of Castile, or Juana la Loca, right? Who marries Philip, the handsome Felipe el Hermoso, and they go on to have Charles V, which becomes this great emperor. But, like her, she ends up being branded as mad and crazy and stripped from her titles because everyone around her wants to benefit from whatever's left, right? So, of course, there was emotional and psychological stress that plagued both her lives and Charlotte's life, obviously. And she ends up being removed. and she was ostracized, and no one protected her in the end. So, first, what do you think that Charlotte's story and bitter end tells us about the role of women in the decline of the great empires?
Well, yeah, it's such a tragic and dramatic story, Charlotte's. So in that sense, in terms of the role of women, she is, like Maximilian, she's very smart, very intelligent, and fiercely ambitious. But of course, even an aristocratic woman in the 19th century to play a meaningful political role, that has to be through the husband. And actually, it's in part what attracts her to Maximilian, because the Habsburgs are the most illustrious dynasty in all of Europe, right? So marrying into Habsburg should be a sort of path into power and importance, which is what she wants. In Mexico, in fact, because Maximilian is often dubbed by his enemies when he's in Mexico as a royal tourist. He loves nothing more than going on tour, visiting all of the towns, villages, cities. He's really into botany and natural science, and he collects rare specimens of insects and butterflies and things like that. So when he's off doing that, Carlota, Charlotte, she's ruling in Mexico as regent, and she's got a completely different approach to Maximilian. Maximilian prevaricates, procrastinates, never makes a decision if he doesn't have to. And so when he has meetings with his ministers, they sort of talk for hours and nothing happens. And then Maximilian's ministers are shocked when Carlotta's chairing the meetings because she comes in, she's prepared, and she's already made the decision, and she tells them what to do. So she's a formidable woman, and actually the French generals much prefer her, and partially because her mother's French, and therefore there's that kind of affinity, but also because she's much more pragmatic, and she just gets things done, and she understands the situation much better than Maximilian, who's a bit of a naive dreamer. He thinks that he'll be able to win everyone over with his personal charm and charisma, and Carlotta's always writing back to France saying, "We need more troops." We can be liberal and once we've been victorious. So she's hard-headed, pragmatic, and very intelligent. She speaks in numerous languages, but she has this tragic end, as you say, which is it's not an end because she lives on for a long time. But she goes back to France after Napoleon III has announced he's withdrawing his troops because she thinks that she can persuade Napoleon III to change his mind. And by the way, she's already persuaded Maximilian to stay in Mexico, because when Maximilian hears that Napoleon III is withdrawing his troops, Maximilian decides to abdicate, which Carlotta is furious by. It's absolutely terrifying. You can read the memorandum that she writes to Maximilian, saying that you can't abdicate, it's cowardice, it's dishonorable, and that essentially you will die here in Mexico, or triumph. And I think you get to a stage in your relationship when your partner writes you a sort of 10-page memorandum about your behavior. I think even I would have backed down in the face of that. But she goes back to France, tries to persuade Napoleon III to change his mind. She's brought with her letters in which Napoleon III has said, "My support will never fail you." She brings out the letters, shows them to Napoleon III, and the French emperor starts crying. Doesn't change his mind though. He's absolutely done with the Mexican intervention. He's getting his troops out. So Carlotta's got one more trick up her sleeve, which is to go to the Vatican in Rome and speak to the Pope. Because, as we've said earlier, Maximilian has confirmed most of Juarez's reforms and therefore alienated his core constituency of Catholic conservatives. If he can get an agreement with the Pope that sanctifies his church-state relations, then, of course, those Catholics have to get behind it, right? Because the Pope has ordained it. So that's the plan. But the pressure of the mission, which is essentially the survival of the empire, and also potentially her husband, who she has convinced to stay, right? So she's got a lot of pressure riding on this. Her mind begins to unravel, and she displays signs of paranoia, delusion. She thinks that Napoleon III is trying to poison her. And this all comes to an incredible denouement in the Vatican, where she breaks in unannounced, demands to see the Pope, and breaks down in tears, sobbing in the corridors of the Vatican, claiming that her entire entourage, from Mexican ministers to servants, is in the pay of the French emperor who wants her murdered. And she's lost all reason. She's absolutely convinced that people are trying to poison her. She stays the night in the Vatican, which is not the done thing, but they just can't get her out because she's so terrified that if she leaves the safety of the Vatican, she'll be killed. And when she gets back to her hotel room, she sequesters herself there, refuses to eat anything except for nuts and oranges, which I guess, you peel them yourselves, right? So you can be fairly certain it's not poison. And then eventually there's one maid that she does trust, and she gets live chickens to live in the room with her. And then the food has to, the chickens have to be killed and plucked and prepared in front of her so she can see the entire process. So she is completely delusional, really sad. She never fully recovers, so she doesn't go back to Mexico. And of course, what compounds the problem is in the 19th century with mental problems like this, the normal practice was to isolate the patient, which of course only exacerbates it. And so she never really makes a full recovery. She goes to Miramar, which is the amazing castle that Maximilian constructed on the Adriatic. And then, her Habsburg family are pretty disinterested in her, in all honesty, and she ends up with her Belgian family. And she lives until 1927, which is extraordinary. There's a fantastic story in the First World War. In 1916, the German army invades Belgium. And one of the German officers sees the Habsburg colours flying from a Belgian castle. So he goes and knocks on the door and says, demands who's got the right to fly the flag of the Habsburgs, who are fighting with the Germans in World War One. And the servant opens the door and just very coolly tells the German officer, it's the Empress of Mexico. Which is extraordinary in 1916, right? It's almost, it seems so recent. And a German soldier actually then puts a sign up saying that this is the Empress of Mexico, don't disturb her, because she doesn't want to be disturbed. And she has moments of lucidity, so she's not completely delusional for the rest of her life, but she never returns to how she was before the breakdown in the Vatican. So it's a very long and sad and lonely life that she leads, really.
Yeah, totally undeserved and probably deserves a lot more attention in the history of women in politics. And I don't know if you are aware of this, but here in Mexico, there's a lot of work done on in the history of music. And in the 90s, there were several CDs released, songbooks of the French intervention, the first and the second. So in these folk songbooks, musical historians have collected these popular songs that are very simple, that presumably soldiers and people from Puebla, where the troops stayed the longest, made all these songs, not only for the time during the conflict, but even in the aftermath. And what I find always very moving is that even though we Mexicans have every reason to be offended and hate the gods of Paul Maximilian and Charlotte or Carlota, actually, for many, many years, she was still known as Mama Carlota. So there is a lovely song, Adios Mama Carlota, Adios mi dulce amor, like goodbye, Mother Charlotte, goodbye, my sweet love, and when she finally leaves, never to return. So it's very endearing, because I think even in this tumultuous time, we haven't talked really about what the average Mexican thought about all these, right? Because we were all caught up in this political madness, and it turns out that even in the broken spirits and all these chaos, we found in ourselves some compassion for these, for both, I think. Well, for Maximilian, probably more fascination, but for Carlota, definitely some compassion. And I think, it's something probably she would have liked to have heard, it would have given her some comfort that oh, Mama Carlota, we still love you. And the cultural footprint, obviously, of this very, very short-lived, under 4 years of Habsburg Empire, was much larger, obviously, than what it lasted. And it was very transcendent in many, many, many different ways, because the Mexican white upper classes, absolutely fed their European obsession of adopting new forms of sociability and entertainment, and having waltzes and dining and all these things that emulated these great European societies. So even after Juarez's return, all these things made a comeback, and obviously even more strong, in a stronger fashion with Porfirio Diaz, at the turn of the century. So it all comes back with more force than ever, and it becomes this kind of nostalgia. And Mexico is still this kind of nostalgia for the 4 years that never were, the empire that never was, and obviously there was another impact, on the other side of the Atlantic, but it wasn't the same. For us, it's endearing, it's messy, it's a mirage, but in Europe, just like you just have said, it's just source of shame and embarrassment, and let's never talk about these, please. So, but I think on the other hand, there were other sort of cultural impacts, like creating or reviving this fascination for Mexico. New Spain attracted a lot of fascination for travelers and adventurers. Probably the last great adventure that ever came. naturally scientist was Friedrich Wilhelm Heinrich Alexander von Humboldt, obviously. But then afterwards, after all of these, many other travelers kept coming, from Adela Breton, Karl Lumpolz, Motley, Catherwood before, again, like Humboldt. So I think in my opinion, you will tell us your version from Europe, it sort of fed this fascination from Mexico. Like, oh my God, it's still unknown. It's still unpredictable. There's still so many things to be discovered. And obviously, your book stems from a larger previous research, which is your PhD, and the whole impact of all of these events that occurred in Latin America, in Europe, and how it came back again. So why don't you give us some views about this renewed fascination? What attracted people? What brought them here again?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that this episode seems so bizarre in many ways, and so almost out of time, even in the 1860s, implanting a European aristocrat onto a throne and creating a monarchy in Mexico. It does feed that fascination and European view of Mexico as somewhere quite extraordinary and unknown and exotic. And it's the kind of place where you would get a Habsburg Archduke turn up for a few years and then get executed. So it confirms a lot of those, I guess, what stereotypes about Mexico for Europeans. It does lead to a lot of exchange, of course, as well. And there's a lot of research and trade during that French period. In terms of its impact in Mexico, I think it's what you were saying earlier is of course it's the national myth, the unifying national myth of Benito Juarez, but also really importantly the complete defeat of the Conservative Party and that conservative movement as a viable political project for decades, really. But then, of course, the tragedies. I'm not an expert on Diaz, so I'm not going to wade into the debate too much, but. Of course, what you don't get in Mexico is the sort of democratic and free republic that, of course, a lot of people thought that they were fighting for. And of course, Diaz is one of the generals fighting against the French. And one of the great ironies is there's a letter that Napoleon III writes to Maximilian because he's always trying to give advice because he doesn't think Maximilian's ruling very well and thinks he's being too liberal. And he says to Maximilian, it's not through parliamentary liberty that Mexico will be governed. What you need to do is create a liberal dictatorship, right? So the idea that you have the secular reforms of Juarez, but you don't worry too much about the democracy. Well, that formula sounds quite familiar, I think, to anyone who knows, what happens with Diaz afterwards. So it's another sad irony, I guess, that comes out of it, is that the hopeful project of Benito Juarez and a lot of Juaristas is not realized in the 1870s. Quite the opposite. The other impact that we should mention is that it, from a geopolitical point of view, it absolutely confirms the dominance of the United States of America. It was a deliberate challenge to US power, and it failed disastrously. And I think it deters any European government from any kind of meaningful intervention in Latin America until the Cold War, when, of course, you have Cuban Missile Crisis, that kind of stuff. So, the defeat of conservatism in Mexico, the unifying myth of Benito Juarez, and the confirmation of US power and hegemony.
And because some of my listeners will kill me if I don't ask this, because several have sent me this question. So we hear endlessly about European monarchs or, in this case, aristocrats or princes being sent here to rule. Let's imagine an opposite scenario. And this is a crazy question. What if, just entertain me, please. Montezuma, the last Aztec emperor, who was raised to be a statesman, a prince educated in politics, what would he had made of a rule in Austria? Like, let's go and he had, arguably, probably he had more authority and believed more in himself, and so himself probably more as a statesman than Maximilian, probably much more similar to Carlota. I'm thinking, no?
Yeah, well, fantastic! I love the idea of an Aztec on the Austrian throne. Yeah, the movement should be reversed. That would be extraordinary, wouldn't it?
Like, which I'd never know, but I love that idea. And Edward, I really enjoyed your book. Like, I just flew through the pages. Your prose is beautiful, it's engaging, it's clever, and also, very importantly, it's very compassionate. And I think it's something we need in the way we are revisiting history today. You know, we are very indignant about many things, but also we are measuring by our own standards. And I think your very compassionate view on almost everyone, but especially on Carlota and Maximilian are something that bring a lot of nuance, and I appreciate it. And it's a great window for people who are not familiar with the history of Mexico in the 19th century, of course, because I think in Europe there's just this broad idea of indigenous pre-Columbian cultures, and then nothing. Vague concepts about the colonial life. Nothing present day, spring break. And like, come on, there are a lot of things happening in between. So I really think you give us a very enticing invitation to explore, especially for non-Mexicans, to explore this fundamental century for Mexico, the 19th century, with a very sexy story of love, ambition, war, and death. So it's a perfect political thriller. Of course, and I see a movie even in the background. So, why don't you give us some idea? What brought you to Maximilian? What things you discovered during this process that made you, I don't know, sort of like fall in love with him? And then things that exasperated, the bejesus out of you when you were getting intimate with his story.
So it grew out of my doctoral research, which was on sort of French imperialism and connections with Mexico and Mexican intellectual thought that sort of underpinned the Conservative Party. So of course the Second Empire was a subset of that, the Mexican Second Empire. But I was always from a very young age. So at school I did 19th century French history, and so this was when I was sort of 17, 18. And there was just this tiny, tiny bit, in the textbook, which says, "Oh, France invaded Mexico," and I was like, "What?" Because as you say about how it's kind of viewed outside of Mexico, this story is just not known in Europe at all. It's absolutely. I mean, some people might have heard of Cinco de Mayo. They probably don't know what it's about. They should listen to your excellent episode to find out. And they might know it through a very famous painting by the French artist Edouard Manet, The Execution of Maximillian. But again, they know the painting. They have no idea who Maximilian is. They might not even clock that it's in Mexico. So it's just such an extraordinary tale. It's just endlessly fascinating, at times barely believable. And I think just what attracted to me it was, as a historian, trying to explain that, make sense of it, because it is an incredible drama, and it does seem bizarre. But actually, I think when you get down into the documents, the archives, to the motivations of the individual, sort of each decision on its own merits does make sense. But it's just when you add it all together with, people breaking down in the Vatican, Maximilian's execution, the heroism of Benito Juarez, it becomes, as you say, a sort of a Hollywood movie that I think if you made it up, people wouldn't believe it. I think with Maximilian, and I'm sure that readers have this frustration, is that, I mean, he's undoubtedly the nicest man you could have at the head of an evil imperial regime, and there's so many moments of frustration where you just when I'm writing research, I was just screaming, just go home, just abdicate. He's talked out of it twice, once by Carlota and then once by his conservative allies, and yeah, because I mean, you can kind of, I mean, obviously we know what happens, but he should have seen what was coming, and I think, but potentially he even did. Certainly by the end, I think he had sort of resigned himself to a heroic death, an honourable death, if he would have seen it. But just a man of endless contradiction and fascination, and so yeah, you could spend a lifetime researching him, I think.
Yeah. Well, certainly people can start with your book, obviously, best start. Where can people get your book? Obviously in the UK, every bookshop outside the UK, where can people get it?
So it's the US publisher is Basic Books. It's called The Last Emperor of Mexico, and the UK publisher is Faber and Faber, and available in all good bookstores and online. And you can follow me on Twitter as well, at Edward Shawcross, if you want to be kept informed of all things Second Mexican Empire related. And thank you so much for that wonderful review that you gave, and for having me on the show. I've enjoyed it enormously.
Oh, thank you. It's been my absolute pleasure. And I just figured, and I'm curious, have you been talking about this with an actual Mexican? Because all the interviews I've heard, you like talking with historians from America and obviously from Britain, but I'm like, no, we need to have this conversation for the benefit of honoring your own research. So thank you. I really enjoyed it, and people need to read this book. Reach out to you on Twitter and follow you on your next adventures. Edward, thank you very much. I'll let you to go on with your day and back to your girls. And it was lovely talking to you.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. This episode was produced and presented by me, Rocio Carvajal, and my guest today was historian Dr. Edward Shawcross, author of the book The Last Emperor of Mexico. To hear more about this historical period and the previous events that led to the unfolding of this crazy episode, I will suggest you check out episode number 70 of season 5, which is about the history of Cinco de Mayo, which will give you more context about the national and international political landscape. Please check this episode's notes on your podcast app to find the link to listen these previous episode number 70, and also to follow Dr. Shawcross on Twitter. Get his book in the format of your choice, printed, digital, or in audio format. The Last Emperor of Mexico is really a great introduction to a little explored passage of Mexico's history and the serendipitous involvement of the great European powers of the 19th century. Please bear with me for the following episode about the cultural history of Mexican cookbooks and the formation of a national identity. I promise it won't disappoint. Well, that's it for me today. Take care, my friends. Until the next time.